Hey guys, tonight we're tracing the smell of something ancient: salted fish, damp wood, and the faint sting of candle wax through 1,000 years of kitchens. You're standing in a medieval town square, and the bells of the local church have just rung noon. A monk shuffles past, murmuring something about fasting, and suddenly you realize the butcher stall is closed. No meat today. You probably won't survive this if you're hungry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the mud of the 11th century market, where a man in a stained apron sells barrels of herring. He shouts about the Pope's blessing for the sea's bounty, and how eating fish instead of meat brings your soul closer to heaven. Around you, people nod, whispering about sin and salvation as if they can taste both in the same bite. The rule is simple: on certain days, no meat. Not because of the weather, not because of the price, but because heaven said so. Or at least someone in a robe did. At first, it wasn't about holiness at all. The earliest Christian fasting rules were half borrowed from Jewish tradition, half from necessity. Food spoiled fast. Meat was expensive. So skipping it wasn't just piety, it was survival. But then came the ritual. Wednesdays for mourning the betrayal of Christ, Fridays for his crucifixion. You eat fish instead because it's cold-blooded, and somehow less sinful than a warm, bleeding creature. Historians still argue whether that reasoning came from theology or just clever marketing from the local fisheries. The funny thing? You'd think people were miserable, but they weren't. Medieval fasting wasn't starvation, it was performance. You'd walk into a noble household and see tables groaning with everything but meat. Eel pies, buttered vegetables, spiced grains, and enough fish to feed a village. Lent, those 40 days before Easter, was supposed to be austere, but it became an excuse for creative cooking. Some monks even claimed certain animals were fish if they lived in water. Beaver tails, for example, were fair game. Picture it: a monastery kitchen, smoke curling from clay ovens, a young brother stirring a pot of almond milk stew instead of cream. The air smells faintly of nutmeg and penance. He probably doesn't know why Wednesday is the rule. It's just what you do. Like checking your phone before bed. Habit disguised as virtue. By the 7th century, popes began formalizing these rules, and suddenly the calendar itself dictated appetite. Whole weeks marked by red ink, meatless days stretching like quiet echoes through time. You can almost hear the pages turning in dusty manuscripts. On Wednesdays and Fridays, abstain from flesh. The word flesh itself meant something heavier back then, not just meat, but temptation, indulgence, desire. Eating was moral theater. Here's your first quirky detail. Archaeologists found fish bones in surprising places, far inland, in castles miles from any sea. That means fish was traded, preserved, and prized, almost sacred in its distance. It had become the taste of obedience. Even peasants, when they could, saved pennies to buy salted cod, not because they loved it, but because it proved they followed the rule. But let's be honest, rules are made to be bent. You can imagine the medieval cook muttering, "It's not meat if you can't hear it moo." So eels became a loophole delicacy. Puffins counted as fish, and some monks quietly argued that young geese being born in water were spiritually aquatic. Bureaucracy met biology in the weirdest dinner debates of history. The rhythm stuck. Week after week, generation after generation, you learned to mark time not by the sun or the moon, but by what was missing from your plate. A strange comfort in repetition. The church didn't just save souls, it programmed your stomach. And maybe that's why, centuries later, when you skip a burger on a random Wednesday, something ancient hums in the background of your brain. A faint whisper from those monks in market stalls, still echoing across the dinner table. The medieval world had many rules, but this one tasted simple. Sacrifice a little to remember the sacred. Or, if you're cynical, keep the fishermen in business. Either way, the pattern stuck, woven into calendars, prayers, and cooking pots. You might smile at it now, but back then this was serious. So, as the church bells fade and the fishmonger packs up his barrels, you realize the rule wasn't really about meat, it was about control. Of the body, the mind, and the world's most basic hunger. Tomorrow, when the butcher reopens his stall, people will feast again. But tonight, the air smells of salt, bread, and quiet obedience. And as you drift a little deeper into that hum of old superstition, you can almost hear the hiss of frying fish echo through the centuries. You wake to the rhythm of bells again, and this time the sound isn't calling you to prayer, it's calling you to profit. Because sometime in the 12th century, the church's meat rules stopped being just spiritual and quietly became financial. You walk through a seaside town in southern France, waves slapping against the docks, and see fishermen hauling barrels of glistening herring and cod. They're not praying, they're counting coins. The Pope may have written the rules, but the ocean cashed them in. Wednesday and Friday fasts created a permanent demand for fish, and that meant money. Big, holy money. There's even a saying whispered among the boatmen, the holier the ban, the fatter the purse. Every time a cleric reminded peasants to avoid meat, the market for fish soared. You follow a group of traders into a counting house that smells of damp parchment and seaweed. They talk of papal bulls, trade routes, and the price of salted cod in Venice. Religion had become logistics. What began as a humble act of penance was now a full-blown supply chain. The church blessed the sea, kings taxed the ports, and fishermen prayed only that storms wouldn't destroy their divine quota. The irony? While priests preached restraint, monasteries were some of the biggest fish consumers in Europe. Imagine monks in Canterbury dining on sturgeon and eel stew, while peasants gnawed stale bread. Lent wasn't a famine, it was a redistribution of flavor. And historians still argue whether popes encouraged fasting for piety, or because it kept their allies in the fishing guilds happy. You pause at a market stall where a merchant boasts of his latest miracle. Fish so well salted it can travel from Norway to Naples without rotting. The man swears it's a gift from God, though you can see the glimmer of silver coins in his eyes. Behind him, a small painting of St. Peter hangs crookedly, the fisherman apostle, patron of their prophet. The lines between heaven and commerce blur like ink in rain. Then come the kings. Royal edicts reinforce the church's calendar, but for different reasons. Take Edward III of England. He didn't just enforce fish days for religious devotion. He did it to protect the domestic fish trade. Every bite of salted herring was national policy. Even the language shifted. Meatless became patriotic. When the king ate fish, everyone else followed, pretending it was about faith while counting the savings. You wander through the docks of Lübeck, a Hanseatic city booming with fish barrels bound for Catholic Europe. Men chant prayers before loading ships, but it sounds more like business than worship. They are exporting salvation by the ton. Across the continent, from Portuguese sardines to Scottish salmon, the church calendar became an economic heartbeat. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, it was all part of a divine business plan. Here's a curious tidbit. Some monasteries actually bought fisheries outright, turning abstinence into a literal investment. There are records of abbots arguing over river rights like Wall Street brokers. They prayed for souls in the morning and haggled over cod prices by afternoon. In God we trust, indeed. And the political layer? Deliciously messy. Popes and monarchs clashed over who got to tax fasting fish. The Vatican claimed divine authority, kings claimed territorial waters, and the fishermen just wanted a fair tide. You could say the world's first seafood tariff war was waged with rosaries and ledgers. Still, for ordinary people, the rules held a strange comfort. Everyone knew what day it was by what wasn't on the table. In a world without calendars on phones, fasting days were time itself. They shaped weekly rhythms, like the background baseline of society. Even weddings, wars, and executions sometimes paused for them. No one wanted to die on a Friday when God's eyes were extra watchful. And yet rebellion simmered. You overhear a merchant in a tavern whispering that he sells meat secretly on forbidden days. He hides sausages in barrels labeled dried apples. The church calls it sin, he calls it survival. When caught, he pays his fine and keeps selling. He's not alone. There's always a black market for forbidden flavor. The Pope knew it too. To enforce obedience, confession became the church's quality control system. People whispered their dietary sins into the dark, and priests kept the statistics. If too many locals were cheating, sermons grew sharper and the punishment heavier. But every sinner was still a consumer. Guilt, it turned out, was also good for business. Historians still argue whether this was manipulation or merely adaptation. Did religion shape commerce? Or did commerce quietly reshape religion? It's one of those chicken and fish problems you can't quite resolve. By the 14th century, fasting laws were so embedded that no one questioned them. Every Wednesday without meat was like breathing. It just happened. You'd hear the same sighs from Scotland to Sicily. Ah well, it's fish day. And somewhere in Rome, a ledger quietly recorded another shipment blessed by abstinence. You step back from the scene, watching sunlight glint on the water. The sea smells both holy and corrupt, depending on how close you stand. And you start to understand. Meatless Wednesdays survived not because of belief, but because they worked. They fed economies, filled ships, and made obedience taste practical. As gulls wheel above the docks and the merchants close their shutters, the wind carries the mixed scent of salt, incense, and cooked cod. That's the perfume of power, old and briny. Tomorrow the priests will preach humility again, and everyone will nod, mouths still slick with fish oil. The air feels heavier now. You're no longer by the docks, but inside a monastery. Stone walls cold enough to bite your fingers, corridors smelling of damp wool and old parchment. It's Wednesday again, and somewhere a bell tolls the signal for dinner. Or rather, the signal for not dinner, depending on how you define it. You shuffle along with the monks in their robes, silent, heads bowed. They're not allowed to speak at meals, so everything happens in a choreography of scraping spoons and soft coughs. You take a seat on the long wooden bench, the table already set with bowls of lentils and pickled fish. The broth smells faintly of onion and incense, and you realize this is not about flavor. This is about control. Discipline dressed as devotion. See, back then, the church didn't just think of fasting as skipping meat. It was a tool to train the soul through the stomach. Flesh fed flesh, they said, and if you indulged too much, you were feeding your sins. Meat wasn't just food, it was firewood for temptation. In the hierarchy of hunger, fish was humble, meat was prideful, and abstinence was holy. You watch a young monk hesitate over his bull. He stares at the steam rising, probably imagining roast lamb or dripping bacon fat, the memory almost sinful by itself. A thin older monk nearby glares at him. Lust of the tongue, he'd say, is still lust. They believed every appetite mirrored another one. And here comes your historical fact for the night. By the 13th century, monastic fasting rules were so strict that some orders ate no meat at all, ever. The Carthusians, for instance, survived on vegetables and fish year-round. Their cookbooks read like survival manuals: turnip stew, pea paste, mushroom broth. Yet somehow they lived long enough to write moral commentaries about the virtues of hunger. You might think all this was purely spiritual, but here's the twist. Monasteries often cheated. In secret records, you find notes like special dispensation granted due to illness. Translation: Brother Matthew really wanted a sausage. Some abbots even invented theological loopholes, claiming that meat broth didn't count as meat. It's the medieval version of saying, I only had one cookie, but it was broken, so the calories escaped. You hear the scrape of a chair. A monk stands and begins reading aloud from a text while everyone else eats. It's always scripture or sermons, words meant to feed the mind while the body stays hungry. But sometimes the readers slipped in something different. A travelogue, a saint's vision, even the occasional gossip disguised as moral caution. It was the only entertainment allowed at dinner. There's a rhythm to it, almost hypnotic. The slow chewing, the echo of the reader's voice, the scent of boiling herbs from the kitchen. You could fall asleep right here if it weren't for the gnawing in your stomach. Maybe that was the point, sleepy holiness. And yet, beneath all that quiet, the human body still whispered its rebellion. In the dormitories, monks dreamed of feasts. In confessions, they admitted to nibbling forbidden meat or imagining it too vividly. Some flagellated themselves afterward, others just prayed harder. Historians still argue whether these rules really curbed desire or just rerouted it into guilt. One old story tells of a nun who claimed to see demons dancing around her bed whenever she craved roasted chicken. The priests took it seriously. They said gluttony was the devil's back door into your soul. Of course, from a modern view, it sounds like she was just hungry. But back then, hunger was never just hunger. It was spiritual warfare. And that's where the sin and skin part really gets interesting. Medieval thinkers believed the body was corrupt by nature. So to discipline it, deny it, was a way to prove you were in charge of your own flesh. Fasting made you pure. Meats, especially red meats, were thought to stir the blood, heat the passions, make you lustful. Fish, cool and moist, was holy food. They even described it in those exact humoral terms: cold, wet, safe. There's your quirky tidbit for this section. During Lent, people invented fake meats shaped from almonds, wheat, and fish paste. They'd mold roast chickens out of dough and color them with saffron just to pretend they weren't fasting. Spiritual cosplay, basically. As the meal ends, a bell rings again. The monks stand, still silent, and file out. One of them looks back at the empty bowls. Maybe he's wondering whether holiness should taste so bland. You follow him down the corridor, where candles flicker against the stone. He pauses at a small window overlooking the garden and whispers, just loud enough for you to hear. The stomach has no faith. Later that night, as you lie in your cell, you hear the faint rumble of someone's belly echoing through the walls. You can't tell whose it is. Maybe yours, maybe everyone's. The whole monastery is hungry for the same thing: comfort, warmth, permission. And outside, beyond those walls, the world is changing. Merchants are getting richer, towns are growing, and somewhere across the sea, reformers are sharpening their pens, ready to rewrite every rule that keeps you from a good steak. But for now, you close your eyes to the sound of fasting silence and drift somewhere between guilt and grace. You wake again, this time to a louder world. The quiet stone corridors of the monastery have vanished, replaced by the sharp crack of boots on cobblestones and the smoky scent of rebellion. It's the 16th century, and Europe is arguing with itself. Somewhere, Martin Luther is nailing his complaints to a church door, and someone else not far away is roasting forbidden bacon just to make a point. You walk through a bustling German town square, where the smell of sizzling pork and brewing ale thickens the air. The fasting rule, the one you've been following for centuries, has become a battlefield. Once a sign of piety, now it's a symbol of oppression. And nothing tastes sweeter than defiance, seasoned with salt and grease. At a tavern corner, a burly man in rough clothes raises a tankard and laughs. If Rome tells me not to eat meat on Friday, then I'll eat 2 pigs on Sunday. The room erupts in cheers. You're watching history chew on theology. Because here's the truth. When Protestants broke away from Rome, they didn't just reject indulgences and papal power, they rejected the menu. Meat became a declaration of freedom. The Reformation turned lunch into politics. Luther himself was famously skeptical of fasting. He said God didn't care what went into your mouth, only what came out of your heart. But for ordinary people, it was simpler. Eating meat meant sticking a fork in the Pope's authority. You stroll past a butcher's stall that has "Free Christians Eat Freely" painted above it. The irony isn't lost on you. The same act that once symbolized humility now screams rebellion. In England, Henry VIII made it official. After breaking from Rome, he loosened fasting laws, but not out of mercy. He wanted to control the economy himself. Yet, fun fact, he still reintroduced fish days later to support the English fishing industry. Historians still argue whether that was patriotism or just political protein management. In France, things were more complicated. Nobles still wanted to look devout, so they followed the rules in public. But behind those heavy velvet curtains, their kitchens were smoky with secret roasts. Servants whispered, "The Lord fasts in the chapel, but feasts in the kitchen." You can imagine the scent drifting through corridors. A dangerous perfume of power and hypocrisy. Your quirky tidbit for this section? Some Protestant towns organized public bacon feasts. Whole crowds gathered to eat pork in the open as an act of spiritual rebellion. Think of it as the world's first anti-fasting flash mob, but not everyone was laughing. For devout Catholics, breaking the rule wasn't just disobedience, it was betrayal. The idea that holiness could be undone by a bite of meat still burned deeply. In Spain and Italy, inspectors and confessors tried to sniff out those who broke fast secretly. Literally, sniff out. There are accounts of priests walking door to door during Lent, checking for the scent of stew. One woman in Naples was fined for smelling of beef. Imagine explaining that in confession. You follow a priest down a narrow street, candlelight flickering on his robe. He's weary. He doesn't want to police hunger anymore. "The people have changed," he mutters. "They no longer fear God, only taxes." And he's right. The church's grip is slipping, not because the faith vanished, but because the meaning of rules did. Fasting used to bind people together. Now it divides them. Meanwhile, across the channel, in England's Inns and Manors, something strange happens. Abstinence becomes fashionable again, but not for salvation, for status. Rich people start observing fish days as a mark of refinement. They make seafood exotic, expensive, a kind of reverse rebellion. So whether you're eating fish or meat, someone somewhere is judging you. And that's the beauty of this era. It's chaos on a plate. Kings legislate diets, priests reinterpret scripture, peasants pick sides with their stomachs. One man's sin is another man's supper. You find yourself at a long table in Geneva, where a group of scholars debate fasting between mouthfuls of stew. They quote scripture, argue in Latin, sip wine, and eventually agree on nothing. One man finally shrugs and says, "The devil doesn't hide in the meat, he hides in the mind." That line stays with you. It's the perfect summary of how far the idea has drifted. Because by now, it isn't really about faith at all. It's about identity. Whether you eat fish or pork, fast or feast, you're declaring who you are. The rule that once united all of Christendom now draws battle lines. And as wars flare across Europe, with soldiers burning churches and looting monasteries, the idea of Meatless Wednesday starts to fade. But it doesn't vanish. Like smoke, it seeps into memory, hiding in habits that refuse to die. Later that night, as fires glow in the distance, you sit beside a small camp of travelers. They share bread, cheese, and salted fish. Because, rebellion or not, it's still Wednesday. One woman chuckles softly. "We fight about the rule," she says, "but we still follow it without knowing why." You look at the simple meal in your hands and realize she's right. Tradition doesn't end with arguments, it just changes flavor. Historians still argue whether fasting truly lost its meaning after the Reformation, or whether it simply became cultural instead of spiritual. Maybe both. Maybe neither. But as dawn creeps over the fields, the smoke from last night's feasts mingles with the church bell's distant echo. And the air smells of both faith and defiance, an aroma that never really goes away. It's centuries later now. The air no longer smells of incense and wet stone, but of frying oil and neon lights. You stand at the counter of a fast food chain on a Friday in March, surrounded by the faint hum of soda machines and the quiet sizzle of fish fillets. Somewhere above the register, A poster reads, "Try our Lent special, crispy fish sandwich." And there it is, the ghost of every monk, merchant, and monarch you've followed so far, reborn as marketing copy. You watch a teenager in a visor scoop fries into a paper box and shout, "Next order." He has no idea that the reason his manager ordered extra fish this month is because a 7th century pope decided people should fast before Easter. The rhythm never broke. It just changed music. You unwrap your sandwich and the smell of tartar sauce and fried cod hits you like a relic of holy nostalgia. It's easy to laugh at how ancient this habit is, but think about it. Whole corporations build campaigns around something most customers don't even consciously believe in anymore. The Meatless Friday rule still moves money, even when it doesn't move faith. You bite into the sandwich and imagine a cathedral bell somewhere in Rome tolling faintly in approval, or maybe in irony. Back in 1966, the Catholic Church officially relaxed the rule. You were no longer strictly required to skip meat every Friday, just on certain days like Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. But here's the funny part. People kept doing it anyway. Habit is stronger than doctrine. It's as if the soul doesn't need the memo that the rule changed. Historians still argue whether this persistence is due to cultural inertia or subconscious reverence. Either way, Fish Fridays survived the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, and TikTok. You look around, a man in a business suit dips his fries in ketchup while scrolling through his phone. A kid hums softly to himself, pulling apart a fish sandwich like it's communion. You realize the act doesn't need belief anymore. It's become muscle memory, passed through families, calendars, and grocery sales flyers. Here's your quirky tidbit for this stretch of time. In 1962, McDonald's first introduced the Filet-O-Fish, specifically to attract Catholic customers in Cincinnati who avoided burgers on Fridays. When sales doubled, the sandwich went national. In other words, a medieval penance helped invent one of the most profitable fast food items in history. But beneath the grease and nostalgia, the same old ideas quietly linger. The idea that restraint purifies, that routine sanctifies, that abstinence in any form can be holy or at least healthy. Modern culture still flirts with those same medieval impulses. We call it cleansing, detox, intermittent fasting. You skip steak not for salvation, but for wellness. The motives changed, but the pattern didn't. You step outside, the city buzzing around you. It's Wednesday again, somehow still a day that feels different. Maybe you're not religious, but there's a strange comfort in the repetition. The idea that one day a week you eat lighter, pause longer, think smaller. It's like muscle memory for the spirit. The irony deepens when you think about how globalized this habit has become. In parts of Latin America, fish markets still burst with customers before Lent. In the Philippines, vendors quote Bible verses while frying tilapia by the roadside. In Poland, whole towns smell like herring on holy days. Even in secular cities, grocery stores quietly shift their promotions each spring as if honoring a deal signed centuries ago between popes and fishermen. So here you are, standing between the sacred and the commercial, the old and the new. A customer in line behind you asks what the special is today. You smile. "Fish," you say. "It's always fish." And maybe that's the point. The church once told you what to eat to save your soul. Now capitalism tells you what to eat to save $5. But somewhere deep inside the ritual, beneath the fries and the slogans, there's still a trace of the original idea. Pause, reflect, show restraint, even just for a day. Historians still argue whether that's faith surviving in disguise or just nostalgia pretending to be morality. But maybe it doesn't matter. Because every time you choose the fish instead of the burger, you're participating in a chain older than any restaurant, any nation, any screen. And now, as night falls, you walk home through the glow of streetlights, full but not heavy. The city hums like a distant choir, and the air smells faintly of salt. You think of the monks in their silent halls, The sailors loading barrels of cod, the rebels grilling bacon in secret, the popes balancing ledgers, and the factory workers pressing fish patties under fluorescent lights. They all share this moment with you, centuries apart, one quiet bite at a time. So take a slow breath now. Let the noise of the world fade a little. Imagine that same soft hum you heard at the start, the fan in the corner, the whisper of old stories still circling the room. You're not in a medieval market anymore, not in a monastery or a McDonald's. You're just here, somewhere between hunger and history. The rule that once divided kingdoms has become something gentle, almost comforting. A rhythm of pause and release, of fullness and emptiness. You can almost feel the weight of time exhale beside you, like an old companion settling into a chair. You picture a long table stretching through the centuries, wood, stone, plastic laminate, and every seat filled with someone quietly deciding what to eat or not to eat that day. They don't all know why. Maybe they don't need to. The act itself is the memory. Outside your window, maybe there's the faint scent of rain or the hum of traffic, modern echoes of the same tide that once carried barrels of fish to fasting towns. And as your breathing slows, you realize the real miracle isn't the rule, it's how it endured. Through faith, through rebellion, through habit, through hunger. So close your eyes now. Let the centuries blur. You've walked from the sacred to the ordinary, and somehow found a quiet holiness in both. Sweet dreams.